the gap between those who are earning a lot versus those who are earning very little. How would you solve for that? You can put on your mic and let me know, or you can put it in the chat, and I'll just give a minute or so just for that. How would you solve for inequality? And there's no right or wrong answers. I just want to know some of the ideas that you have as well. Amber, Nicole, Monica, Kieran, Vaughn, nice to see you. Ria, how would you solve for inequality? And I know Kieran is not going to say taxes. Yes, Vaughn, I see your mic is on.
So couldn't you create a more equality in society by providing certain tax cuts for people that earn less? So low income households will either pay less tax or no tax, and progressively you will raise taxes slowly. But you could also do special government programs for low income houses, like maybe offering a university fee, lower university fees on students that may not be able to regularly go to a university. Instead of charging them the full price, you charge them discounted prices. You give them special pricing cuts if the income is too low to help balance inequality, so that it gives people more fair opportunity, and it's not, oh, your parents had a lot of money so you got an easier start. It's more giving everyone, even though you were born with less money, you've still got equal opportunities to someone who was born with more money.
Run for president. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Absolutely. I like that idea. I like that idea. Ria says, create chances in the economy because taxing the rich isn't doing that much because of corruption. So essentially, end corruption, then create chances in the employment realm. You know, Ria, I 100% agree with you. I think that South Africa and Vaughn, you obviously pointed this out as well. You find that we actually have very good systems around this. As is, we obviously tax people or individuals who don't earn that much, far less than we charge people that earn quite a bit. But regardless of that, where that money goes is just as important, because if you're corrupt with that money and that money is not going to what it should be doing for the country, then we'll always be one step back. And that one step back begins to be another step back. And next thing you know, we are obviously moonwalking into a very dangerous place. So I 100% agree with that as well. So for corruption, make sure that we eliminate it as much as possible. I don't know if we can deal with it completely, but definitely eliminate it as much as possible. Certainly look into ways where people can have opportunities that would otherwise not necessarily have that, so that the opportunity playing field, regardless of your upbringing or where you're from, you at least have the opportunity to make better of yourself. And I think sometimes NEFSIS, I don't know if you guys are acquainted with them, they're a fund that basically gives student loans, to individuals and so forth. Even though it's student loans, it's just one of their ways of saying, look, if you're in an income, if you're in a household that didn't earn that much, you can still go to school. You will owe us, but you can still go to school and make something of yourself. And there was a radio interview I was listening to, and someone got to the point of actually getting a master's degree, and they said, look, man, I was able to actually circumvent poverty simply because I went with NEFSAS and I studied like there was no tomorrow. So there are means and ways out there, but the question is, how is the administration process, and how do we, obviously, as Ria put across, begin to let go and desist from corruption as well? Right, guys, that obviously ends our chapter 21. I think the last idea that we just shared there was that, one of the ways that they're looking to do that is being able to give everybody in the country 300 Rand at least. And that idea was given by a professor that, give everybody like 300 rand at least, and that might solve a bit of the problem. Now, the interesting thing about that is that whilst I think it's one thing to obviously give everybody money, I think it's another thing to teach people about money. And I think one needs to draw the balance between the two of those as well. There's a statement that's out there, and it might not be a popular statement, but it's the whole, if everybody had the same amount of money in the economy, the money will, give it a year or two, the money will simply go back to people that um, are either rich or have serious entrepreneurial skills. And we have to figure out why that is the case and begin to develop such skill sets amongst everybody else. So financial literacy is actually where I'm going with that idea. I don't know what your thoughts are. Let me know in the chat, or you can put on your mic and give me a shout in that regard as well. As I wait for that to happen, you can turn your books to page 462, where we will now talk about economic growth and business cycles. Economic growth and business cycles. Now, I'm sure most of you will remember that one of the macroeconomic objectives is to ensure that there is economic growth. And just let me know in the chat, how do we measure economic growth? What is the instrument we use to measure economic growth? Absolutely, Ria. GDP, being gross domestic product, being gross domestic product. And obviously, we realize that gross domestic product, in and of itself, comes in two. We've already discussed this in prior sessions, but I think it's always a good thing to repeat because repetition deepens the impression. We have your real GDP and then we have your nominal GDP. And I remember in class when we talked about someone earning 10,000 in 2010 and someone earning 10,000 in 2021, or just a different time gap as a whole, we realized that the person that was in 2010 earning that money obviously earned a whole lot more from a real perspective. But from a nominal perspective, being just the face value of the actual amount, they're exactly the same. So when it comes down to like looking at your economic growth, we're looking at both of those factors and sitting down and saying, hey, how have we grown in real terms and how have we also grown in nominal terms as well. But now there are four problems that happen with your GDP. The first is that GDP doesn't count for non-market production because remember we do final goods and services and nothing before that. So they don't take into account that somebody slaved a couple of months in order to get a product out there that's sold. That's not what they're aiming for. Instead, they look at just the rand value at the end of the day. And whilst that is a picture in and of itself, it's not the full picture because we also have to understand what it actually took for this person to create that product. There's also unrecorded activity. And this unrecorded activity really comes from the informal sector, right, which would be people that don't necessarily have taxes or pay taxes. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, here. um, you'll find that when there's informal practices around just GDP and so forth, that's not added towards GDP and therefore that's not taxed as well, right? So you almost get into a space where the GDP in and of itself is not necessarily accurate. It's not necessarily accurate simply because at the end of the day, we don't have your unrecorded activity. Also, we look at things like data revisions and we realize that, look, man, we always need to consistently have data in front of us. Now, for analysts, they sit down and they're like, this is frustrating for us, guys. We consistently have to have these new tools in front of us. And when the new tools come, we have to almost reorganize ourselves and get the new GDP out there. And that takes quite a lot. But the honest truth is, at the end of the day, for us who are the consumers, we need to see the most relevant tools being used for GDP. So data revisions is also one of the problems. And once again, economic welfare we need to look at as well. And even if a country is growing stupendously, what one might come to the conclusion of is that the country is doing well. When in actuality, just because they're doing well from a product perspective, a gross domestic product perspective, it doesn't mean that they're looking at things like pollution, right? Which is, of course, a big, big factor as well. Things like that also need to be taken into consideration. I don't know if there are any questions in that regard, in concern with some of the problems that are associated with GDP. Just let me know in the chat if that's the case. If not, give me a thumbs up and I'll just keep going. Okie dokie. So next we talk about things like your business cycles. Now I'm sure those of you who have parents that own businesses, or if you know some entrepreneurs around you, you'll realize that some months they are, on top of the world because their bank account tells them, hey, thou art rich. And then some months they look at their bank account and they say, why am I doing this again? And basically, that is what we call your business cycles. That sometimes you have your peaks and sometimes you have your troughs. Peaks being the highest point, troughs being the lowest point. Now, between a trough, the lowest point, and a peak, we call that an upswing. That is when you start obviously getting into a position where your business is beginning to pick up. When we look at between a peak and a trough, we call that a downswing. And that's when obviously things are not working out that well. Now, an interesting thing about figure 22.1 is that you'll see that A, you were in a trough, then there was an upswing to B, but at B, you then had a downswing from a peak into a trough, being C. Up and down, up and down, up and down. But in the long scheme of things, when you look at a business 10 years, 20 years, you realize that it's only been going up. And I'm sure you guys have seen graphs that look like this. I know it's terrible. Just let me know in the chat if you've ever seen graphs like that when we're talking about the news and stuff like that. Yes, no? Absolutely, right? And once again, if you take a straight line, you'll realize that things are going well. It's just that in that moment, you feel that things are not necessarily going as well as you want them to. And that's perfectly fine. It's part and parcel of business growth. Absolutely, absolutely. Exactly that. In fact, when you invest in a company, you're actually looking at that as well. So very good point there, Kieran. You're looking at how has this company been performing over the past couple of years. Now, within your business cycles, and we're talking about causes of business cycles, you get two different factors, or three actually. You get what we call your exogenous factors. You then get your exogenous, sorry, endogenous factors. And then lastly, you get your structural or structuralist factors. Now, when it comes to your, and I'm going to start with the endogenous. When it comes to your endogenous factors, what you're looking at there, so I meant exogenous, apologies. These words, I think at 4 o'clock, after 4 o'clock, they begin to phase me. But anyhow, when it comes to your exogenous factors, you're looking at what are factors that are outside the business that have been harming the business, right? For instance, climate change, depending on what type of company that you have, those things that are basically outside of my market system. What are those things? And depending on what happens that's around me, sometimes that will affect my business. And this was something that was obviously given by what we call your classical economists. People sat down and said, no, man, it really has to do with the fact that there are other things that are happening that are messing with the business. Right? On the other hand, or giving the business different cycles. On the other hand, we get endogenous factors. And endogenous factors in this case was really something that what we call the Keynesian economists came up with. And Keynesian in this case, meaning obviously your aggregate demand really pushes for this. Right? And when aggregate demand changes, then obviously your business changes as well. So you're looking at it from the point of view of that, no, it's actually an internal thing. It's within the business. That there's certain things that just won't make sense. Right? Then obviously we get your last guys who obviously are structuralists, and they sit down and they say, look, man, you know, fluctuations can be caused by legislation that's passed, e.g., let's say the Poppy Act or Papaya Act that was passed recently, where your information is obviously now protected a notch before it was a couple of years back. And that means that now if somebody calls me and I did not give them my number, that can be a bit of a mess, right? So if you're a company that was able to buy numbers of individuals and so forth, or data, now you can't necessarily do that. And I'm sure you guys have seen whenever you get onto a website these days, they have an additional cookie to say that, are you allowing us or are you denying us? I'm sure you guys have seen that. Just give me a thumbs up if you have seen that before. Yeah. And that's just to let us know at the end of the day that we need full permission to obviously get your details. Seen when you go onto a website, it just tells you that we've got cookies here, and are you allowing us to basically get information from you and stuff like that, things like that. It's happening on most of the websites that I've been on, and I'm sure you guys will have noticed that obviously depending on the websites that you join, you'll find all of a sudden when you're on YouTube, there's something about, no, if you want to lose weight or you want to buy new shoes, this is the way you need to go. Things like that type of advertising needs your permission. Before, I think it was just a matter of them just picking up what you Google. Now it's not necessarily the case. They actually sit down and go, hey, man, we actually need permission to go ahead and do something like that. So then that's the whole institutionalist point of view. Right? But now we need to measure business cycles. And in this case, when we're talking about measuring business cycles, we're looking at how do we begin to start predicting how well a business will do versus how bad a business will do, in concern with just the ups and downs, the troughs and the peaks, the upswings and the downswings. And just let me know in the group or in the chat, or you can put on your mic, what do you think are some lead indicators that show that things are turning up, that there's going to be an upswing and businesses are going to make a whole lot more money? What are some things that you think are like that? Sorry, sir. Sure. Structural factors in this case just simply means things like legislation from governments and so forth. And a good example is that, when South Africa was sanctioned, I know Zimbabwe recently was sanctioned. Things like that can cause a business to obviously begin to move from a peak to a downswing. I hope that makes sense, Amber. Let me know. Awesome. So guys, tell me, what are some things that you'd look at and say, hey, that's a lead indicator. If this thing, if this happens in the economy, it means that businesses are about to start making money. What are some of those things? Or what would you deem to be one of those things? Let me just say.
So you know what? I know you're probably gonna think, oh my word, this guy hates taxes. But to
Yeah.
be honest with you, if I owned a business, which hopefully one day I own plenty, but if I had to own a business and taxes dropped, we're making money now.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it.
Wouldn't an
Okay.
indicator also be of a business picking up if you saw there was more traffic to the actual business, or maybe there was more Google searches for your particular business, or there was a more active user base through that? Wouldn't like if there was more hype or talk around the business, wouldn't that be an indicator that perhaps there is going to be a turn up in the business?
Definitely, definitely. I also think that to a large extent, when we talk about the repo rate reducing or the taxes beginning to reduce, and Kieran does have a point there, or as you put across, Vaughn, in this case, having traffic, monitoring traffic and seeing that that's, beginning to pick up, then you know that there's going to be an upswing. An upswing is on its way, right? One of the leading ways that they also do this, guys, is car sales. Car sales. Can you believe it? The more, if there's a certain period, and obviously they'll compare two certain periods together, maybe 2021 versus 2022, and depending if people start picking up a lot more cars in 2021 as opposed to 2020, then they'll look at 2022 and say, hey, I think that there's going to be an upswing there, just simply by cars and so forth. So that's a very interesting one. When I read that, I was like, what? Cars? But it's pretty much true. It's pretty much true. It's pretty much true. All right. Guys, are there any questions in concern with upswings and downswings and just business cycles as a whole? Let me know in the chat. If not, just give me a thumbs up. Awesome, Vaughn. We'll do the highlights just now. We just have about 2 more pages to go through, and then we are 3 more pages to go through, and then we're done. On page 446, 466, I mean to say, it says sources of economic growth. Sources of economic growth. Man, and I'm a big fan of economic growth, a huge fan of economic growth. Right. Now, when we talk about sources of economic growth, in this case, we have once again, and I'll just put here economic growth. We have two specific factors. And we're talking about supply factors in this case. And I will ask a very good question at the end of this, and your demand factors as well. Now you'll find with your supply side, right? With your supply side, it's basically looking at the factors of production. And in the chat, just remind me, because I'm old and I forget. Remind me, what are the factors of production? Oh, we've got labor, absolutely. Got capital, love it. Land and entrepreneurship. Guys, when from a supply perspective, if any one of these begin to start growing, the labor force, if that grows, there is economic growth. If the capital grows, there's economic growth. And I'll get back to that just now. If there's more land to be used, then there can be some economic growth. And in this case, sometimes it's finding a new mineral of some sort, right? Then obviously entrepreneurship, guys, and I'm biased, but I'll just do this. When it comes down to entrepreneurship, I think that is the main one out of the four. That if you can ensure that you have enthusiastic entrepreneurs, the supply factor will always grow. Now, when we talk about capital in this case, we've got two things. We've got capital widening, and I will write that out. And then we have your capital deepening. Sorry, watch that. When you think of capital widening, all you're looking at is how do we increase our capital to accommodate an increasing labor force. And that basically means that if I hire 10 people, how do I make sure that I also are able to get them 10 computers as well, or machinery to match that percentage growth that I'm obviously emulating? Then the other is capital deepening, and I'll just read the definition as is. It says capital deepening occurs when the amount of capital per worker is increased. That is when the growth in the stock of capital is greater than the growth in the number of workers. Such a situation is referred to or preferred to as an increase in the capital intensity of production. I think a good example of that is being able to give this person more tools to work with. So instead of giving everybody the same type of tools, you give one person a couple more tools to work with. And as a result, capital deepens. All right, that's the supply side. Now we've got our demand factors as well. And once again, you will not believe that we've got our formula being C side plus G plus exports, net exports. And if the consumption obviously rises, or investment rises, or government spending rises, then we're in a good position. We want to be in that type of position. The only problem with this, guys, when you look at C plus I plus G, specifically C plus I plus G, which is what we call domestic demand. The only problem with this type of growth is that it causes inflation. So ideally, the best way to obviously grow an economy is really looking at your exports and saying, how do we improve our export situation? But at the same time, you look at your imports and you ask yourself the question, how do we decrease our imports? So when it comes to demand factors, your net exports, or just your exports as a whole, is really the best answer there, right? But when you look at your demand, domestic demand, be C plus I plus G, that obviously causes inflation. When you look at your imports, decreasing your imports, that also becomes I'm not too sure if I want to do that, because what if I hire or I buy something within the country and it's not as good as that which is outside the country? And you'll find that most of the time when we import things, it's usually for company growth in the sense of capital and so forth. I mean, as is, I work with a Dell laptop. I'm sure most of you will have some sort of laptop with you. Dell is not a South African brand. And the question I have to ask myself is that if I said that I'm only going to sponsor South African brands, I'd have to say, where is a South African computer or laptop? I have to trust that brand because I need to work off that brand. I hope that makes sense. So you'll find that that's actually very expensive. There's a entrepreneur that I know of, and these guys, what they do essentially is that they are creating cell phones. And one of the questions that they asked was that one of the questions that the panelists, or rather the delegates asked the panelists, being one of these individuals, was that, are you using sites here in South Africa? And his answer was, no, I'm not, because it's very expensive to do it here. We do not have the type of equipment. And if we wanted to purchase that equipment, would have to spend a lot more money purchasing the equipment and then a lot more money training people to use that equipment. But that's a very good long-term perspective or long-term thing you want to do. But in the short term, it becomes very detrimental because you're really messing with your cash flow. Okay. Just something else on page 468. On page 468, we have your some fundamental causes of low economic growth. And really, at the end of the day, guys, there's three reasons as to why you have low economic growth. Firstly, it's institutions. And I will happily say the following, that if there's a lot of corruption in the country, you can expect, without fail, that the country's growth is very, very low. Fact for fact. On the other hand, we also look at things like your geography. If you've got a country that has got terrible weather, absolutely terrible weather, right, and is located in the middle of nowhere and has no resources, the chance of that country making money or beginning to produce things becomes 0 to none. And then lastly, we have a thing called culture. And I'm sure we dealt with this both in your business management class and last semester. Whoever took you as a lecturer for Economics 1A would have told you about your traditional approaches. Right? If your country is very traditional, using means and ways of the past to create products and services, your country will be left in the dark soon enough. It's just a matter of time. But sometimes culture does do that, especially with your, and it says this so in the textbook, so I'm not picking on anybody that would be of that religion. But when you look at countries that are very religious, like deeply, deeply religious, you find that to them, it's just a matter of saying that we just want to be in a space where we're right spiritually, and finances becomes a second or secondary issue. And in those countries, I can bet your bottom dollar, same thing, that obviously stagnates economic growth as well. Guys, are there any questions in concern with chapter 22? That's the end of chapter 22. Are there any questions in the concern with chapter 22? Let me know in the chat.
So I just want to ask, in the factors of production, their capital, there are 2 points there. Is that widening and deepening?
Yes, it's widening and deepening. And I see that the deepening looks like, oh boy, actually both of them look like trash. So apologies for that.
No, I'm just asking. So that's in relation to capital.
Yes, that's in relation to capital, 100%.
Okay.
All right, cool. Guys, let's get down to some highlighting, and then we will call it a day. We'll start off highlighting journey on page 462, and it'll be the last paragraph on right before some problems associated with GDP. The last paragraph, just before some problems associated with GDP, and it reads as follows: the total real production is commonly presented by real gross domestic product, real GDP. Recall that real GDP means that the measurement is at constant price. However, we need to look at a few problems associated with GDP as a measure of total production or income in the country. Right, and the problems that they have there are your non-market production, we've discussed that, your unrecorded activity, your data revisions, and your economic welfare. And you can highlight maybe the first sentence in each and every one of those paragraphs because they really do go into some good detail in that regard. Just something very important on calculating economic growth is the concept of real GDP per capita. And that basically looks at what one person is more or less earning in the grand scheme of things. And you obviously want that to be much higher than your GDP if possible. But if we look at obviously your table 222.1, you realize that that's not necessarily the case. And that's obviously a problem. On page 463, that first paragraph under the business cycle, it says the business cycle is a pattern of upswing and downswing that can be discerned in economic activity over a number of years. One complete cycle has 4 elements: a trough, an upswing or expansion, also called a boom, a peak, and a downswing or contraction. The different elements of the business cycles are illustrated in figure 22.1. Then on page still 463, under causes of business cycles, you'll find the words exogenous in bold. And it says the regarded fluctuations in the growth of the economic activity as temporary phenomenal that would be described as exogenous factors, factors that originate outside the market system. Then a couple of sentences thereafter, I think about one sentence, if I'm mistaken, it says the changes in weather conditions affect agricultural production and therefore also the total level of economic activity. And that's just them basically putting across the fact that at the end of the day, it's very important to note that there are exogenous factors. And that obviously came from our classical economists. The second one, exogenous factors in bold as well. It says many other, this is the the last paragraph at the bottom of page 463. Many other classical economists formulated theories of the business cycle. The common element in all of these theories is that the causes of business cycle are sought outside the market system, that is, in exogenous factors. And then on page 664, 464, I mean to say, on the left-hand side, third paragraph, it says, Keynesian economists, on the other hand, do not believe that the business cycle is caused by exogenous factors. In contrast to to the classical economists, they believe further that governments have a duty to intervene in the economy by applying appropriate monetary and fiscal policies. Canadians believe that the business cycles are part and parcel of the way in which the market economies operate. In other words, they believe that the business cycle is an endogenous phenomenon. And you'll find that obviously when you talk about Keynesian economists, we're really looking at aggregate demand. Specifically in this case, we are looking at your government spending being your monetary and fiscal policies. And we have discussed that in grave detail as well. Then just the last thing to highlight in that specific thought on page 464 is the last paragraph on the left. It says there's also a third possible explanation for the fluctuations in economic activity. According to this explanation, which may be called the structuralist or institutionalist explanation, economic fluctuations are caused by various structural or institutional changes. And Amber, thanks for asking the question that you did around that as well. Still on page 464, measuring business cycles. In your second paragraph, that whole second paragraph, absolutely important. Please highlight that. Please also note on page 465, just the different views on business cycles. Your classical view, the Keynesian view, and the structuralist view as well. All of them have exactly the same y-axis and the same x-axis as well, being real output versus time. Right. On page 466, sources of economic growth. Just the sentence that includes supply factors and demand factors, please highlight that. It says these sources may be grouped into two broad categories. Supply factors and demand factors. Economic growth requires an expansion of the production capacity of the economy as well as an expansion of the demand for goods and services produced in the economy. Both the supply factors and the demand factors are therefore necessary for sustained economic growth. That is the long run trend indicated in figure 22.1. Right, and obviously with the supply factors, I would say highlight just the bullet points: natural resources, labor, capital. And the important thing in capital, which is a new idea, would obviously be capital widening and capital deepening. And then lastly, your entrepreneurship. Right, and then last but not least, your demand factors. And I'll literally go to the last paragraph on the left under demand factors and say, as we've seen, the total demand for goods and services of consumption demand C, investment demand I, government demand G, and net exports. The various components of aggregate spending or demand may be used to distinguish between three sets of demand factors: domestic demand, which consists of consumption C, investment I, and government spending G; export demand, being X; import substitution, which involves attempts to reduce imports. Then you can obviously highlight domestic demand, exports, and import substitution. Then on page 462, or sorry, 468, there are three more things to highlight and then we're done. The second paragraph, after some fundamental causes of low economic growth, it says institutions are humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction and provide the incentives to which people react. They relate to the political, legal, and regulatory framework and include property rights laws, constitutions, traditions, and markets. Depending on how well those are, I can assure you a country will do well. If they're poor, however, chances are there's something wrong with those specific elements. Then we have geography in bold. And it says there geography refers to the physical and geographical environment and includes climate and ecology. So regions are very important. And the last one to highlight is culture. It's in bold. It says those who emphasize culture argue that different societies have different cultures because different shared experiences or different religions. According to them, culture is an important determinant of values, preferences, and beliefs, which ultimately help to shape economic performance. A good example, obviously, would be America, which is Protestant. And as a result of it being Protestant, the wealth message was something that they obviously took very much to heart. And we can obviously see how that developed for them. Guys, are there any questions in what we have put across? Please let me know in the chat. If you're good to go, though, give me a thumbs up and we'll take it from there. Awesome, Kieran. Awesome, Vaughn. Monica, Ria, Litle. Great stuff. Right, ladies and gentlemen, it means that tomorrow when we meet, I know that I've seen a scheduling there. All we're going to deal with is just inflation, and then we would be done with the semester as a whole. What I will obviously ask you to do, guys, is go and do the ICE tasks. If you're scoring anything below 60%, we need to relook that and see how we can be of assistance. But go do the ICE tasks, get as much practice in there as possible. But for here now, guys, do enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. And the lessons thereafter, we'll just be doing exercises. Ria, let's see what you say. So I have one question about unemployment. Is the way South Africa measures unemployment, or good question. It's the way the world measures unemployment. It's not just South Africa. Awesome. Thanks, Kieran, and thanks, Monica. Pleasure. Very welcome, Ria. All the best for the rest of the day.